As the oldest institution of higher learning in Northern Kentucky, we take great pride in our history, the significance that William-Madonna College, Thomas More College, and today Thomas More University has had in the developments of Northern Kentucky and the many lives that our institution has shaped and touched over the past 100 years, and the role that we continue to play in shaping the future of Catholic higher education. Looking ahead to this milestone gives us great excitement to recognize our past and our legacy, but more importantly, it gives us an opportunity to forge our future and destiny as a premier Catholic liberal arts university. We are fortunate through the generosity of William Bill Robinson and his wife Joan to have established the William T. Robinson Institute for Religious Liberty at Thomas More University. Established in 2015, the mission of the Institute is to advance the American concept of religious freedom as an unalienable right and the protection of this right for all people. Since 2015, the Institute has sought to bring dynamic and distinguished scholars to our campus to engage in conversations that are timely and relevant. The William T. Robinson Institute for Religious Liberty exemplifies the very best of a liberal arts education and the importance in understanding the differences that make up our world and our communities. And these differences should unite us rather than divide us. As I think of my own children, Colin and Emma, who many of you have met, and the world that they will inherit, we all need to do a better job of listening and understanding differences while maintaining religious freedom. Here at Thomas More, as our mission states, we challenge students of all faiths to examine the ultimate meaning of life, their place in the world, and their responsibilities to others. The university's mission is timely, relevant, and compelling. At the forefront of the institution's work and vision is Dr. Ray Hebert, Executive Director of the Institute, and the Executive Committee, with whom I'd like to thank for their work in putting together this wonderful event this evening. This evening's event, Reclaiming the Public Happiness, America's Higher Education Legacy, brings together three distinguished scholars. I'd like to extend a warm Thomas More welcome to Dr. Paul Gaston, our keynote speaker this evening, Dr. Deborah Humphreys, and Thomas More University's Dean of Education and Health Sciences, Dr. Kim Haverkos. The strength of Thomas More University is evident this evening, and I thank our distinguished scholars in sharing their work and their passion with all of us. I hope you all enjoy this evening's presentation and conversation. Again, thank you for joining us, and welcome to Thomas More University's Reclaiming the Public Happiness, America's Higher Education Legacy.
And now I have the honor to introduce our three panelists for today. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Paul L. Gaston. He's a frequent speaker at national conferences, an Association of American Colleges and Universities Distinguished Fellow, and a consultant to the Lumina Foundation. He is the author of several books, including General Education Transformed, Higher Education Accreditation, General Education and Liberal Learning, and the Challenges of Bologna. He is completing a book on higher education credentials scheduled for publication in 2021. He earned his master's degree and PhD from the University of Virginia, where he was a Woodrow Wilson Fellow. Also, Dr. Kim Haverkos, a native Western New Yorker, now transplanted Hoosier, earned her BS from Xavier University in biology and an MED in science education from the University of Cincinnati. Kim joined Thomas More's education department in the fall of 2012 after receiving her PhD from Miami University, where her dissertation work included girls' attitudes and behaviors around going green and STEM. Her areas of research and teaching continue to focus on education, cultural studies, and issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Haverkos currently holds the title of Dean of the College of Education and Health Sciences. At the same time, she continues to teach in both the graduate and undergraduate programs in the Education Department at TMU. Kim also serves on a number of committees, both internally and externally, and is always seeking to improve her learning at all levels. Our final panelist today is Dr. Deborah Humphreys. As Vice President of Strategic Engagement for the Lumina Foundation of Indianapolis, she directs their efforts to assume the quality of education beyond high school. She also oversees the Foundation's strategic communications and stakeholder engagement teams. Her degrees are from William College and Rutgers University, where her advanced degrees were in English, MA, and PhD. For purposes of this evening, she has decades of experience in higher education, reform focused on improving teaching and learning, curriculum design, and quality assurance, both for the Association of American Colleges and Universities and the Lumina Foundation. She is on multiple editorial advisory boards and regularly conducts faculty workshops on teaching and learning around the country. So as you can see, we have a very distinguished panel for this evening. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Gaston to begin the keynote. You see the title before you. And so, Dr. Gaston, thank you.
Thank you very much. I was struck by that line, a frequent speaker, thinking back on the last 14 months and on the pleasure of this evening, which is, in fact, the first chance that I've had to speak to people in a group like this since January of 2020. And it's a particular pleasure to do so in northern Kentucky, where I served for 6 years as provost at NKU, and such a pleasure to see President Votrua and Rachel here this evening. Jim was someone who, at a point in my life when I needed to take another step, knew that better than I did, and I have been profoundly grateful to him ever since. Wonderful that you're here. It's terrific to be in the presence of people, but at the same time, I want to express my particular appreciation to those who are joining us this evening remotely. Your willingness to take part virtually in events like this for the last 14 months have really been what has kept public discourse alive. So please take an active part in the discussion tonight. And I want to thank especially a colleague that many of us admire, Ray Hebert. A highlight of my years in Kentucky was my collaboration with one of the most creative scholar administrators that you will ever encounter, a man gifted with both a broad commitment to public service in greater Cincinnati and a resourceful imagination. Ray has been at the heart of countless initiatives focused on improving lives and minds. Now I'm going to follow the rule that it's always a good idea to thank your commentators before you hear what they have to say about your presentation. But I am indeed grateful to Deborah Humphreys and to Kim Haverkus. We've met a couple of times in preparation, not in person, but we've gotten to know one another, and it's wonderful to have them here. They've kept their powder dry for this evening, I assure you, but they've offered good advice in the planning stages, and I have taken it. Clicker is not clicking. So could you advance to the next slide? Okay, so we'll just try to be in sync. So I also want to thank, as I've mentioned, Ray Hebert and his colleagues at Thomas More, and express my particular appreciation for the technical support that we've received from Dave Schroeder and his colleagues. And my personal thanks to Dr. Joseph Chilo for being here tonight. I know how busy presidents are, and I'm grateful for your presence. President of Thomas More University and Monsignor Gerald Twaddell, the rector of the university's Mary Seat of Wisdom Chapel. It is thanks to leaders such as these that Thomas More has maintained a reputation for effective teaching and vigorous inquiry in a context of faith and tradition. Writing in 1818 to the commissioners for the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson described the benefits and blessings that the legislators of the Commonwealth would achieve through their agreeing to fund a state university. So why don't we just go to the kind of the Thomas More slide. Okay, I want to ask that you give yourself a sigh of relief. I want to make clear that this is not going to be a PowerPoint presentation. Just a very few slides to kind of lay the groundwork. No lengthy Q&A following either, but there will be questions embedded in the discussion. And so don't get comfortable, because I will ask you to respond to some of the points that are being made. And the next slide. Simply reiterating the point that we hope to enjoy a good conversation, which I hope began with my mentioning to you that when he wrote to the commissioners of the University of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson was talking about the benefits and blessings that his legislators would accomplish by voting state funds for a state university. By tapping the public purse to support the university, they would be contributing, he said, to the good and ornament of their country and the gratification and happiness of their fellow citizens. Jefferson was seeking a precedent. Unlike his alma mater, William and Mary, and other colleges at the time, the University of Virginia would be supported largely by public funds. And it would recruit students from all states. And it would be the first college in the United States to offer the kind of curriculum we now think of as typical, one offering disciplines such as botany, architecture, political science, and astronomy. Jefferson was an advocate for STEM education long before the acronym. The Jeffersonian vision of higher education as a public good was to emerge as a distinctive American value. And for the next 150 years or so, the idea that public funds should be invested in higher education to promote the public interest would prevail. In 1862, the Morrill Act would offer grants of land to states so that they might fund the creation of colleges specializing in the mechanical arts and engineering. And in 1890, a follow-up act would establish the proud legacy and sustained influence of historically black colleges and universities. In 1944, the GI Bill would expand the American vision on the premise that higher education should be available to every qualified student seeking a college education. And then in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson returned to his alma mater in San Marcos, Texas, to sign the Higher Education Act that would strengthen institutions of higher education and provide a base of financial support for students seeking a college education. As he signed the bill, Johnson expressed the conviction, and I quote, "For the individual, education is the path to achievement and fulfillment. For the nation, it is a path to a society that is not only free, but civilized. And for the world, it is the path to peace. For it is education that places reason over force. Now let's fast forward about 40 years. In 2004, having incurred dramatic reductions in state support over a period of 2 decades, UVA became the first public university in the U.S. forced to rely more on student tuition and its own resources than on state support. And that led to a further irony. Jefferson had intended that his university would become so inviting and accessible that, and I quote, "Youth of other states will come and drink the cup of knowledge with us." Because the state's contribution to the UVA budget has now fallen well below 10%, the cost to out-of-state students of drinking that cup today has risen to $53,000 a year, not including housing and other expenses. And the Higher Education Act. For several decades, it was reaffirmed routinely with bipartisan support. But since 2003, when the debate on the HEA unexpectedly became divisive and confrontational, the HEA has become yet another partisan issue. As a result, the reaffirmation that should have occurred in 2014 has not happened. Maybe this year, maybe next year, maybe not. And if the temporary resolutions that are required to maintain the act should lapse, millions and millions of students would lose their federal financial aid. So, that leads to the question, what happened? UVA may remain a signal example for the increasing privatization of public education, but is no longer an outlier. Today, in more than half of the states, public colleges must rely more on the resources they can raise than on state support. Since the 1970s, in fact, public support for higher education has been almost continually downward. And as the costs of attending college have increased, so has student debt. In theory, if you were to extend this downward trend of state support into the future, you would reach a point around the middle of this century, earlier for some states, at which state funding for higher education would disappear entirely. That worst-case scenario may not happen, but even now, the costs of post-secondary education pose a barrier for many students. And perhaps I should say especially now, because as Mamie Vaught, who is the interim president of the Institute for Higher Education Policy, says, the pandemic has made deep inequities already existing in higher education more conspicuous. I quote, "Americans who can benefit the most from the mobility that a higher education provides are the least likely to be able to attend college right now." That's a problem, she says. That's a problem for all of us today and for generations to come. This is a challenge not limited to public institutions and their students. Private colleges and universities also depend on federal student financial aid, on state and federal funding for research and other operations, and on private giving motivated by the belief in the value of higher education for society. In fact, private institutions are no less challenged by the erosion of trust in post-secondary education, and some would say even more so. The more effectively we make a case for higher education as a public good, the more all institutions, public and private, will benefit. Now, some of you, including librarians in Kenton County, might want to observe that higher education is not itself alone in facing such challenges. Many other institutions and services that were created to serve the public interest have faced and continue to face a similar dilemma. Increased demands from other budget sectors and an increasing skepticism regarding the concept of public interest have led to reductions in public support for many institutions and services. And that's a recognition worth exploring for a moment. If we were able to advance the slide, I would show you the question, but I'll give it to you anyway. And it's this: what other public institutions and services have experienced and may continue to experience similar reductions in public support and funding, and to what do you attribute such reductions? So Ray Abair has the microphone that he will bring to you so that you can comment on this question. And in just a few moments, those of you who are watching, if you wish to send a chat into the chat room, we will monitor that, and they will share those inquiries and responses with me so that we can include you in the discussion. So looking beyond higher education, which I've been complaining about, what other kinds of public goods and services are other people complaining about that are also feeling the brunt of this lowered support for the public interest?
Transportation.
Transportation. Thank you very much. Public transportation. I think I'm going to move on at this point. If we have the chance to come back, we will come back at the questions that our online participants have posed for us. But I think I'm going to go on to the next question, which is, all right, we've broadened the question somewhat, we've included others in it, but that question is still out there. What happened? What happened back in the 70s? And we haven't really begun to address that yet. Why was it that back in the 70s would an apparently well-established, widely supported, politically popular source of national pride, support for higher education as a public good, be met with increasing skepticism? And frankly, an answer that would satisfy everyone would be difficult to find, and some of you may have your own answers to this. But if we think back to the 1970s, we can identify three substantive issues that lie behind the shift in public perspectives, as well as one bogus one. And I'm going to get the bogus one out of the way to begin with. It's one asserted repeatedly and asserted recently, despite its source in hearsay. It's the claim that liberal faculty members indoctrinate college students. To the contrary, and this is good news for some and not for others, there is persuasive evidence that colleges and universities have little or no impact on the political leaning of their students. But that unsubstantiated narrative, like rumors concerning vaccines or the deep state, has had a pernicious influence on public opinion. In Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, belief in student indoctrination has now become so widely shared that, according to a recent headline in the Chronicle of Higher Education, a county turns against its community college. If you want more on this story, just Google North Idaho College for further information. And I think it would be frankly unproductive to spend time attempting to refute arguments that appear immune to evidence, because there are three other issues that can prompt more than one evidence-based perspective. And these are the important ones: demographic factors, the budget history, and changes in the political climate. And in just a few minutes, I'll invite you to weigh in on these. The demographic issue offers good news and bad news. The good news is that many more American citizens now attend college, or wish to do so. Since 1947, enrollment in post-secondary education has increased by more than 700%. But the irony is that the increasing democratization of higher education has coincided with its commodification, the ever more popular assumption that students should pay their own way to gain the benefits for themselves. That can work to the benefit of the advantaged, those who can meet the financial challenges involved. It does not work so well for the financially disadvantaged, those who stand most to benefit from a college degree. There's also the simple issue of scale, a system that expands rapidly to meet increasing needs, as American higher education has done, will inevitably make greater demands on public resources. It's easier to invest in higher education as a public good when the need for resources is relatively modest relative to state budgets as a whole, which takes us to the budgetary issues. And that budget history for us, one of this seemingly inexorable decline in public spending on higher education and other public services, offers us few recognizable villains. Policymakers on both sides of the aisle have played a role, and that is in part because challenged state budgets must give priority to expanding elements of the budget that, unlike higher education, are essentially non-discretionary: corrections, critical infrastructure, K through 12 schools, health care, particularly the costs for Medicaid. As a result, there has been less money in state budgets for commitments such as post-secondary education. And there are the specific political influences we might identify behind this shift. One very clear precedent appears in a successful campaign in California in 1978 for the passage of Proposition 13. The two most significant clauses in this proposition, a sharp reduction in property taxes and the requirements of a 2/3 majority in the state legislature for any increase in taxes or public revenue, these were to have an immediate negative effect on public education, both K through 12 and post-secondary in the state, and they would require the effective abandonment of a decades-long commitment to low-cost, high-quality public education. And it was in this climate of taxpayer revolt, familiar phrase these days, that Ronald Reagan, campaigning for further reductions in the size and scope of state government, won election as governor of California in 1980. That appeal would resurface in Governor Reagan's presidential campaigns and led in the 1990s to dramatic tax cuts in 44 states, based, every one of them, on over-optimistic revenue projections. It continues to figure in our political discourse today. These three issues, demographic, budgetary, and political, can and should prompt a spectrum of opinions. There are persuasive voices on all sides of these issues, and I think this would be an appropriate opportunity to hear from some of them. So the perspective that I would ask for, what other reasons can you suggest for the erosion of public investment in higher education and other public services as an offering in the public interest? Are there other arguments in favor of asking those who benefit from these services to pay for them? And are there other arguments that support increased public funding for higher education as a public good in the national interest? Let's have you weigh in on these historic issues, these questions of demographics, of budget histories, of politics.
It's a very complex question.
Dr. Vertuga says it's a complex question.
But a couple of things, come to mind. One, public higher education at the state level, I believe, is viewed as the only state agency that has its own taxing authority, and it's called tuition. If you trace the increase in tuition in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, it just about equals the reductions on the state side. So it zeroes out. The other more confounding issue from my perspective is that David Brooks wrote a column a year or so ago talking about how in his career we've shifted from a focus on we to a focus on me. And that common good that you're referencing requires a foundation of we, not me. And that is such a confounding piece for me. One other observation. We in higher education tend to point outward to find villains. I think we're culpable in some ways as well.
I'm going there.
Okay, you go there and I'm going to give you the microphone then. You know, Paul, just number 4,
Yes, sir.
I think that there's an increasing number of people who don't say it publicly but believe we may be educating too many at the college level. And that's frightening to me.
That is right, and I'm also going to touch on that because the other side of that coin is the nefarious view that only a college degree is a credential worthy of respect, and that's another problem I think for us. So those are good additional directions to take, and before I make that turn, I want to just make sure we're not overlooking anything about higher education as a public good, and here I'm speaking of both public and private institutions. And here's a quick list of the bullets. I won't try to bring up the slide, but they expand merit-based opportunities far more broadly than would be the case otherwise. They prepare students for careers and satisfying lives. They contribute to local and regional economies through the people they employ and through the people they educate. They can address state and regional and local needs, and do. They can encourage and should encourage an active and informed citizenship, grounded in scientific literacy and numeracy and historical awareness. They provide employers with employees. They promote social mobility, support the creation of new knowledge, develop technologies to support industry, and offer cultural, intellectual, and entertainment opportunities to their broader communities. And so now I'm going to turn the corner that Dr. Votruba so clearly anticipated. What can colleges and universities do about this? What can they do for themselves? What might they do to encourage a greater emphasis on the public good they offer and on the public interest they serve? And as an academic for more than 50 years an academic administrator for 25 of those years, I find it difficult to admit that we may have contributed to this dilemma, that we may be complicit to an extent in the decline of faith in higher education as a public good. I think we have not taken seriously enough our obligation to tell our story to the public. We've not always welcomed opportunities for greater efficiency. We've too often regarded improving quality and promoting equity as somehow competing priorities. And we've often given the appearance of protecting the status quo. But the positive side to making admissions like that is that if we have been responsible to an extent for this decline in public support, we can undertake reforms that might enable us to rebuild it. A complex problem that has taken 50 years to develop will require a multifaceted solution pursued over time. But my hope is to encourage you to weigh in with your own suggestions on the final discussion question in just a moment. Here are 4 for you to consider. First, tell the story more effectively. If public regard for colleges and universities and for higher education has declined in part because we have not been as forthcoming and transparent as we might have been, a renewed commitment to describe what it is that we do and what we are accomplishing could be a step towards turning things around. We could do a better job of explaining both the reasons for the increase in college costs, many of them beyond institutional control, and the cost savings measures that we have implemented to limit that increase. We can invite our constituencies to support our efforts. We might explain far more effectively the value of accreditation as trustworthy quality assurance, especially important at a time when providers avoiding oversight compete aggressively for student enrollments. Colleges must be able to explain clearly what the credentials they offer promise in terms of learning outcomes and employment opportunities. We should give a greater voice to those who employ our graduates, not simply to publicize their importance, though they are important, but to invite their recommendations. We can make more persuasive arguments for the value of university-sponsored research, for intramural and intercollegiate athletics, and for services colleges and universities provide to their communities. Most importantly, we can celebrate the accomplishments of our students. Second, higher education should place a more visible priority on efficiency and effectiveness. Faced with ever more challenging budgets, colleges and universities have shown themselves to be resourceful. That they seem capable of recovering from the powerful frontal assault of a pandemic is testimony to their resilience. That story needs to be told. Yet, questions have arisen to the inclination of some colleges to close programs and lay off faculty as a first rather than last resort. A university that fires tenured faculty members while adding varsity athletic teams. For a small bribe, I will identify that institution. There is one recently documented example. That kind of thing prompts doubts as to our priorities. We should show our stakeholders, employers, prospective students, policymakers, that we're doing all that we can to make teaching, learning, and the expansion of knowledge our highest priority. And doing all we can will require a long look at inefficiencies in our institutions. Brian Rosenberg, the president emeritus of Macalester College, makes the point. Would a university with fewer internal divisions be able to eliminate redundancies and reduce costs? Almost certainly. Would such a university also teach students more effectively and perform its internal functions at a higher level? I believe it would. A third point, I think, is that higher education must affirm and demonstrate that quality and equity are not competing priorities. They are essentially one compelling priority. In periods like this of fiscal challenge, it can appear sometimes that choices have to be made between improved quality and an expanded commitment to addressing inequities. And we should confront that assumption. Because if a college or university is going to maintain the quality of its programs, then it is going to have to provide access to a broader spectrum of qualified students. And it is going to have to enable the participation of those challenged by finances or substandard preparation. And just as only a diverse faculty and student body sharing a vigorous commitment to equity can provide an environment for quality learning, so too, authentic equity can be achieved only when quality learning leads to the award of quality credentials. It's a huge challenge. I've just completed a book with Michelle Van Noy of Rutgers about, among other things, the stratification in our society and how that's reflected in higher education. We've discovered that routes open to those who are privileged, who find their way to prosperous universities that enable them to earn prestigious credentials that qualify them for professions that protect and extend their privileges. Those routes are for the most part closed to those who are not themselves privileged. A May 22 report from the Pell Institute, and I quote, "When it comes to attending competitive colleges, socioeconomic status matters most. High school students from the highest economic quintile had 8 times the chance of going to a highly or moderately selective college as those in the lowest." Or even more memorable math from last Wednesday's New York Times, a student from the top 1% of the income scale is 77 times more likely to attend a prestigious college than those whose household income is in the bottom 20%. Please don't misunderstand. We should readily acknowledge that access to a small sample of highly selective colleges should not be our measure of an equitable society. That equating of selectivity with quality is specious, a product of the ratings industry. The Varsity Blues scandal reminded us how influential that fallacy can be. The fact is, and it's a fact that can be demonstrated, students who choose Thomas More or NKU are likely to make economic, social, and intellectual gains, what we call value added, far greater than those likely to be achieved by their wealthy counterparts at Stanford. Nor should we fail to acknowledge the opportunities afforded by reputable, career-focused institutions. They are invaluable to the individuals who choose them and to society as a whole. There are millions of success stories that begin in community colleges and technical schools. The priority I'm talking about is that all of higher education respond more effectively to the needs of all students. But that does not mean we should be comfortable with an educational environment in which students must make their educational choices based primarily on family income.